Thank you for your time. My name is Beytullah, and this is Shooting from the Hip, something I'd like to read to you. I appreciate you being here. Please keep in mind what we are doing here on Bet On It, Shooting from the Hip. We explore human ideas, philosophies, noteworthy information. This exploration is us thinking aloud, a thought exercise, jumping into ideas and examining them and re-examining them. You will find we are prone to using adult language and expressing opinions. In keeping with that, you shouldn't believe anything we say. We are not experts of any kind. We are just having fun with these ideas, philosophies, and information, in the hopes you will find it fun and interesting and entertaining. We encourage you to invest time in searching out these subjects and come to your own conclusions. Now on with the shit show! Slim, how you doing, buddy?
Awesome, how are you?
I'm excellent, thanks. So today's episode of Shooting from the Hip, we're going to be talking about the Great Pyramid at Giza. And it's a subject I always find super curious because even though archaeology, in particular Egyptology, would absolutely definitively tell you everything that you need to know about it, there's enough gaps in what they say that allows room for possible other explanations to its origins and its function and purpose, right? Remember, according to archaeology and Egyptology, it's the tomb of a megalomaniac pharaoh who wanted to leave an impression on history that would go on through the ages, right? And they only date it. It's dated back to the Old Kingdom, which spanned about 2700 BCE. So that's 2,700 years before the year zero, right? Because right. Okay, so we're in the Common Era. It's 2024, right? So
I hope that that's understandable.
Okay, well, just to make it clear, right? Just in the event that somebody doesn't understand. So the Great Pyramid of Giza was considered to be a tomb for the pharaoh Khufu, right? And the Greeks called him Cheops. So again, it only adds more confusion because you'll hear people interchangeably refer to the Pyramid of Giza as Cheops' pyramid or Khufu's. And if you're not up to speed on the fact that they commonly interchangeably you refer to it that way, it can be confusing, right? So I know believe it or not, for me, I was initially like, are they talking about something else or a different pyramid or whatever? But anyway, I digress. The pyramid is the oldest of the seven wonders of the ancient world, and the only wonder that has remained largely intact, right? So you're familiar with the seven wonders of the ancient world? I should have probably had the list for them, but I don't.
I'm not familiar with all of them, but I could recognize a few.
All right, so from that time, it's one of the last standing ones, and it's largely intact, which is interesting that they would choose to describe it that way. Because when we get into, because we're gonna address some different ideas of what it might be. Many view it as being basically a stripped down machine or skeleton of the machine, right? So which we'll explain very shortly. It's forthcoming. So it is probably the most famous monument of the Giza pyramid complex. So there's 3 pyramids plus the Sphinx, right? That's considered the complex. And then there's temples just immediately in and around that area, but it's the thing that everybody knows, right? So, and I dare say there's probably even small children are aware of the pyramid at Giza, or at the very least they'd be able to tell you it was in Egypt, right? So it's not that unusual, and it's considered a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So that much is I 100% agree with that. It really is a legacy and of human culture, human heritage. It belongs as much as it's in Egypt, and they have every right to lay claim to it. It doesn't belong to them exclusively. For all of us, it's something super suggestive, and there's so much mystery around it, and intrigue, and it captures our imagination. So that's probably why we're covering it here, because it did capture my imagination. I was always curious about it. And in fact, it's funny. In the 70s, so in 1975, I was 10 years old, and there was this movement. It was a cultural movement. This is all pre-internet, so the memes did not come into existence because of social media and the internet. There was cultural memes that existed prior to all of that, right? So pyramid power was the thing in the 70s, right? Like that you would hear people endlessly go on about pyramid power, which we'll briefly cover. But again, it's something kind of interesting and weird that sprang up out of this fascination around the Pyramid of Giza, right? So here's some interesting details about the pyramid itself. The length each side of the base, so the base of it is a square, right? So each of its sides are 755 feet, so it's about 230 meters. And its original height was 481 feet. That's 147 meters, and currently it's 138, but that's because a capstone is missing. So the top of it is like a flat top, but if you follow the angles of each side, they reach an apex just above that flat top. So that's why it's currently shorter. But when it was finished in its day, it was 147 meters. Now it's 138. Some theorize that the reduced height is a loss of that capstone, the very thing that I was just talking about, and they refer to it as the pyramidion. And skeptics still debate whether or not the capstone existed at all, right? That it might have just been flat, but again, you can argue about it all you want. But another interesting fact: it weighs 6 million tons. And it's calculated from its mass. That means it has a 13-acre footprint, right? So it's an enormous structure. And every time I hear people who've gone to Giza to see it, that they're so impressed by it that it borderlines on being overwhelming. And I can't imagine what that would be like, because I've never been there myself. But I don't. The fact of the matter is, I would only ever want to be there for a day, long enough to spend an entire afternoon like checking it out, and then like, okay, done. I no real desire to hang out in the desert, but that's just me. You?
Yeah, fair enough. I wouldn't enjoy the climate too much, but it would be really interesting to see that. Just the sense of awe you would get would be amazing.
Yeah, I think again, like I say, from what I hear from people who have actually gone there, it's this astounding thing, and it leaves you with an indelible impression on you. It leaves that it's just this thing you walk away from it, and it's unforgettable, right? What's interesting about the pyramid is its mathematic precision, and why that's so unusual. Well, the fact of the matter is, why would anyone go to such lengths to integrate so much math that was meant to be interpreted by somebody else who was seeing it for the first time and had the capacity to take measurements? So what do I mean? It encodes the dimensions of the Earth on a scale of 1 to 43,200. A scale that's not random. 43,200 is derived from the key motion of the Earth, the precession of the axis. That means the wobble in the axis, which is a rate of 1 degree every 72 years. If you multiply the 72 years by 600, it gives you 43,200. Right? So that means that whoever built it understood the precessionary cycle down to they measured it perfectly. So you again, I'm going to ask the question: why would somebody place so much precision in the construction of it. We're gonna skirt some of the answers that some people have given, but we're not gonna address it just yet.
Oh, can I just bring up how?
Sure.
Like,
Sure.
it's very specifically strange to have the precession of the Earth. Like you said, it takes 72 years to actually see
For 1 degree.
For 1 degree.
For 1 degree of the precession.
Okay.
And so the 43,200 is the full precessionary cycle.
My question is, how would they be able to know about this unless there's previously written down notes or
right, that somebody kept records, that because it takes place over such a significant time span, well past any human lifespan.
Right, so I assume there has to be at least some predating culture that they had an inkling of knowledge of. Maybe they left one book on the mathematics of this.
I think you're going to find it gets even more interesting, but instead of jumping into that just yet, let's just cover some more details about the pyramid. Again, that'll contribute to go like, hey, there's something going on here. And I think it's dismissive when you go, it's just all pure coincidence stuff. You go, wait, who the fuck would in their right mind would go to such lengths to integrate all that information into the construction so that if you had the wherewithal, like if you understood the math, you could be able to tease that information out of it. So to me, it's super suggestive. It's much to like what you're saying, that somebody did it with the intent to pass the information along.
Yeah, that seems too coincidental.
Wait till I start giving you some of the more details, and you'll go like, that's so much information. You if it was one detail, you could say, yeah, maybe it's coincidence. But because of how much information's encoded into it, you go like, that's intentional. There was nothing coincidental about it. But the experts will only too happily dismiss it and just say it's just coincidence, right? Or offer up some kind of vague. It's not even an explanation. It's a way to shut down the question because they don't have an answer.
Yeah, there would have to be some way to say, oh, you fudged the numbers on the measurement of the pyramid. But if those are accurate numbers, that's extremely impressive. It's not a little impressive.
Okay, so the dimensions of the planet are defined by the scale of the planet, but that are integrated into the pyramid, right? So you can determine like the diameter of the planet from the pyramid. It's very clever. How did they do that, and where did they get knowledge from something like that? And when I say they, referring to the conventional explanation that somehow it was the Egyptians. Now, it would be wrong to say that the Egyptians of that time, which they were a superpower, in the Middle East at that time, and so something like the Great Pyramid was it demonstrated their greatness, right? Like to all the surrounding enemies and allies, that how great they were. Because if it's baffling now, imagine how baffling it would have been to like Bronze Age cultures, right?
Yeah. Even if they had the capability to make a telescope, which is a huge invention, imagine you're on a boat going over the sea, and then you see that, and you're like, oh no.
The Greeks went on endlessly about the Egypt because there was cultural exchange, and Greek intellects went to Egypt to learn. And so can you imagine, like, again, it would have promoted Egypt in such a way, and not to take anything away from ancient Egyptians. They were very advanced people, very highly intelligent. But the question is, were they intelligent enough to be able to build the pyramid itself? And we'll leave that open-ended. I would rather people hearing all the details, you come to your own conclusions, right? You decide. Don't worry, I'll express mine, but you should formulate your own. So this pyramid is aligned to the cardinal points of the planet, and it's targeted on true north within 3/60ths of a single degree of what true north is. So not magnetic north, which magnetic north kind of it changes position. True north, right? So it's aligned within 1/60th of a single degree. So you take a single degree and within 3/60ths. So if you divide that degree 60 more times, that single degree, it's within being perfectly aligned by 3 of those 60th, subdivisions, right? So again, modern builders would never go to that extra length to align any construction, to the true cardinal points of the planet. So it's just, again, you go like, it beggars the question, why would they do such a thing, right? Unless it was to draw attention to it.
Yeah, like physical symbology.
Symbolism.
Symbolism, yeah.
Yeah. So it incorporates the dimensions of the planet, like the polar radius of the Earth. The polar radius is 6,357 kilometers. That's about 3,950 miles, and it has the diameter of the Earth incorporated into the math, and that's 7,926 miles, about 12,756 kilometers. So again, this is significant information, and it further asks why would you do something like that, right? The measurement of the base of the perimeter of the Great Pyramid, accurately multiplied by 43,200, gives you the equatorial circumference, or the equatorial radius of the Earth. So at the equator, how wide it is at the equator is 6,378 kilometers, or 3,963 miles. So again, and it's accurate information. You think about the level of planning that would have been required to make sure that you integrated all these details in the design, and then you have to go and execute it. Like again, to what end, right? But it's kind of astounding. It's made up of 2.3 million blocks of stone, roughly weighing around 2.5 tons each. There are some significantly larger pieces, but on average, right? And 2.5 million stones. Can you imagine, right? And the estimates are the blocks were placed over a 27 to 30 year period, allegedly using ramps that would mean that and to make the sand wet, and logs to roll everything across. It would mean that blocks would have to be cut, moved, and placed every 2 minutes of every day for 27 to 30 years. So that's the explanation. The explanation that Egyptology and archaeology gives is that they use sleds and use wooden rollers and all this stuff to explain it. But then when you take the amount of blocks and you divide that by the amount of years that they said that the construction took place over, that's how they determined that you would need to cut, move, and place each block. And a lot of the blocks, the granite blocks, came from a quarry that was 500 miles to the south of the actual construction. So when you hear the translation and you understand that it means that like every 2 minutes of every day, 24 hours a day for 27 or 30 years, you go, kind of invalidates their explanation. You go, that's ridiculous notion. They wouldn't have done something like that unless it was relatively easy for them to do it. So then let me ask the question, I'll ask it now. Were the ancient Egyptians capable of doing that? Or did they do the cutting first and then move all the stones into place and then assembled it? Well, wouldn't that increase the amount of time it would take for the actual construction, right?
I get the impression that the 27 or 30 year span could be accurate, but at the same time, if they were really good with mechanics, like just general engineering, using like levers, pulleys, all these sorts of things, you're still put back like 50, 100 years maybe.
Even well, there's an engineer, Christopher Dunn, who's looked at it and brought an engineer's eye to it. And no, admittedly, he's only a single individual, but he does make a compelling argument that even with the advantage of mechanical pulleys and levers, you couldn't do it. You couldn't move that much stone in the kind of volume um, that they're talking about. And you're not just like piling it up. You're actually assembling it in a very specific way because you're following a very specific blueprint or a design, because it has to do certain things, like align with the cardinal points and all this stuff. No small feat, right? We'll get to Christopher Dunn very shortly, but
they would have to master like those engineerings I mentioned, like using levers, pulleys, all that.
Yeah,
What
yeah.
is that? Physical engineering? I forget what it's called.
Mechanical engineering.
Right. They would have to be like absolute masters of that to do that
But
within 30 years.
But I think the working materials of a Bronze Age culture wouldn't have allowed for the facilitation of that. We might, and let me be clear, we might be able to do it under the current level of technology that we possess. So in terms of our technical standing, in terms of like being able to undertake massive projects like that, we might be able to organize to do that. And let me be clear, I emphasize might. It would be very difficult for us to pull off too. So whoever did it had to, at the very least, have the equivalent capabilities, not necessarily the technology, the current capabilities that we possess. And like I said, depending on which experts you ask, there's a lot of them that go that we couldn't pull that off now, right? Especially to the level of detail, because it's a complex structure. It has internal structures, so you're not just laying this shit on top of, assembling it nice and neat and stuff like that. There's chambers, and now from in recent times to discover there's even more chambers within the pyramid itself. That's right. And there's chambers underneath the pyramid, like they go into the ground. So again, I think it's a fallacy to presume that somehow a Bronze Age culture could pull this off. I think it, and again, it just serves their authority in the field of expertise, because they're hyper specialists. So the presumption is that somehow they know better. But if you have engineers who are challenging their assertions, and then what do? They're up in arms. They're like, but again, they're up in arms because they have a vested interest in the subjective view of how this was created. So they think that their view is the only explanation for what has happened, and they ignore details which bring into question their explanation.
Yeah, I've heard it mentioned by other people that if you have an institution where, like this, they're talking about the pyramids and they teach people under them about the pyramids and their specific details, like at some level it is literally a pyramid scheme. I always find that funny, but that is what it could be.
Well, again, it shouldn't surprise anyone that subjectively an authoritarian then would act to protect their investment.
Yeah, I think I don't know what degree is like valuable, but 27 to 30 years seems completely unreasonable.
Well, especially if you're having to place each stone, one stone every 2 minutes. Can you imagine the workforce required to pull that off? Like the raw numbers? I'm going, so whomever it was who did it, they did it because they already possessed the ability to do it. It wasn't outside of what they could do. But now this Stone Age, this Bronze Age culture, that means to define the Bronze Age, that means the strongest metal they were working with was bronze. How do you use bronze then to chip granite, that's considered one of the hardest subjects on the planet.
I've heard arguments where you could get sand or aggregate sand of stone that's harder than it, put it in a crack, and then work it. But then it's like, okay, do that in 2 minutes.
2.5 million times.
Yeah, like
It just seems to me like when you hear the explanations, you go, that's almost silly that they would even like. So then now you have somebody whose area of expertise is ancient cultures, now trying to tell you that they know very specifically how construction, especially of stone monuments, instead of like having an expert in stonework put their 2 cents in. Right?
yeah, because it at least seems like extremely good engineering.
It's the highest expression of engineering, which again, I'll ask the question, do you think it's that level of engineering is something that could be expressed by a Bronze Age culture? They can, not to take anything away from them, they did some sophisticated stuff, but to the scale we're talking,
yeah,
I'm like, it leaves me very suspicious.
yeah, part of it that makes me suspicious is we've both dealt with like hardened foundations, like foundations that have aged and settled, and they're more dense. Not more dense, sorry. They're a lot like harder to deal with. Like when you have a jackhammer, and we have like if you're using a jackhammer, it's a lot better than a hammer and a Bronze Age chisel. It's like even working with concrete was so difficult.
That means their hammers were made out of bronze or wood, wooden mallets that they were using to strike bronze chisels, and the chisels are only a certain degree of hardness, and the stone exceeds their degree of hardness. It would take you centuries to make significant inroads to be able to cut 2.5 million pieces. Come on.
Right. And you know how I mentioned how you could get like the small aggregate sand put in the crack? That's going to eat away at the blade.
That's an explanation that again has been offered up by Egyptologists, but not engineers. Engineers start laughing when they hear shit like that
because it eats through the blade. Like it's obvious that it's going to cut, sure, but you're going to destroy like 100 blades.
And are you going to be able to create the kind of precision cuts that these stones have on them, like perfect 90-degree corners? It's not like they're irregularly shaped. They're almost cardboard cutouts of each other, unless it was for a very specific function, right? And then it would be shaped to fit that function. But it's not every stone. The majority of the stones are the same kind, same size, same everything.
Yeah, it's strange because the outside of it was supposed to be like this beautiful structure to look
at. We're going to get to that, so it's a great segue. So it was limestone, the actual outer surface. So they created, or they cut these pieces of limestone so that they almost seamlessly fit together. So that's within their capabilities of doing it. So this you can attribute to the ancient Egyptians, right? Because they basically put a facade on the existing structure to make it look like this, enormously white, pyramid rising up out of the desert. Could you imagine what kind of more awe than it currently inspires? But there was an earthquake in the 14th century that caused severe damage to the pyramid, and the limestone exterior lining basically broke off. Even though they were kind of seamlessly fit together, they weren't strong enough to resist the earthquake, right? Then the people of Cairo repurposed that limestone to build their own structures within, because it borders right on the city, a major city in Egypt, right? None of the casing stones remains on the pyramid, though some of those casing stones you can find like at the base, like on the ground, stuff like that, like just pieces. But the majority, like I said, were repurposed by people to use to make living shelters and stuff, that sort of thing, right? So why all this detail? Increasing complexity in design and construction. The level of accuracy is important to the creators. That means that they did it because it was meaningful. Right? So whomever built it, the reason why they integrated all that stuff and they went to the trouble that they went to is because for them it served a very specific purpose. Right? So it wasn't, there's no accident there. So, and again, that seems entirely reasonable. And then it brings into question the whole idea that all this shit was coincidence, or the fact of the matter that that it was a construction that was laid out by a megalomaniac pharaoh instead of a structure that was there that already existed and then they laid claim to.
Right. I would see that as reasonable. Like, there's a lot of people who talk about pre-dynastic Egyptians and then the dynastic Egyptians. It seems like I've heard decent arguments for why the pre-dynastic Egyptians seemed more advanced, and maybe there was a cultural issue.
Well, really, okay, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. Please finish your thought.
Oh, I was just gonna say, like, there could have been like cultural issues that caused conflicts. There could have been drought. There could have been all sorts of things.
Okay, so the way you just said it, you are almost implying that whoever the pre-dynastic Egyptians that were living in that region were recent, like in terms of how before the dynastic Egyptians. So the argument that a lot of researchers make, and again, I couldn't say with absolute definitively that they're spot on, but some of them think that it's the age. So when you say pre-dynastic, we're not talking about like 1,000 or 2,000 years before the dynastic Egyptians. Some are talking about tens of thousands of years before the dynasty. So this is a structure that could be coming to us from the very deep dark past, which we don't have any window into. So say 50 to 60,000 years ago, we in terms of like records stuff, we have virtually nothing, at least in terms of humans, other than we know that there at that time there was multiple bipedal humanoids that were kind of like us, not us exactly, but kind of like us, and we were all coexisting at that time, right? It brings into question the age of humans, right? So the conservative estimates now is that humans are 200,000 years old to as much as 400,000 years old. To give you some kind of context, when in the late 90s, they were saying that the current model of human had only been around for 40,000 years. So now think of that for a moment, what that means. So the cranial capacity, the cubic volume space that in the skull to house a brain is the same brain that you currently have, and it potentially could have been around 400,000 years ago. That means that the intellectual capacity existed as much as 400,000 years ago. So, and that's the most liberal estimate, right? But so between now and say as much as 400,000 years ago, what were they doing? And if it took for us 6,000 years to rise to the current level of sophistication, how many cultures could have arisen in that 400,000 years potentially? It's like something like 800 or something.
Yeah, I always lowball
it. I'm just going like it to me like
at least 5.
So to me, I like the convenience of the way that it's explained away doesn't do it any justice. That here we're confronted with a much more profound and deeper mystery. What is it and where did it come from? Because I think it would be fair to say that that it wasn't Khufu and the people of his time that constructed the entirety of the pyramid. They certainly adopted it, and they certainly used it to their advantage, right? Because can you imagine, like, all their potential adversaries and allies of that time would have had an awareness of these like these profound constructions in Egypt, right? That would have and they're all still using like skinned hides and living in wooden huts that are covered in animal pelts. And then here you have Egypt, where they have these astonishing stone constructions, right?
Yeah, that's definitely one way to assert dominance. Like everybody else is just ripping off tanned leather and using it as a flag. It's like, hey, we have a giant structure.
Yeah.
Come mess with us.
So in terms of promoting them as the superpower that they were, I mean, again, it certainly would have been advantageous for them. So.
Oh, one thing I want to mention when it comes to dating.
Yeah.
I heard that the Sphinx lines up with the constellation of Leo at a certain date.
Yeah. So that alignment, it goes back, if I'm not mistaken, it's about 60,000 years where the Sphinx actually aligns with the constellation of Leo, like on the horizon, right? So from where it's sitting. So, and mathematical models have proven that to be true. But there's some people who make arguments about the position of the body of the Sphinx, that's not how lions lay down, that dogs typically sit more like that. So some have argued that it's not a lion, it's a Sphinx, right? So, rather a jackal, right? Tall-eared dog, right? So I mean, again, it's clear that there's no definitive answers.
Right. I just thought if you take the fact that it's pointing in that direction, maybe the star constellation was seen as a jackal or some sort of, like four-legged animal. If that also corresponds to the date you would find with the three pyramids, the way they're aligned, facing
Orion's belt.
Yeah. If those timelines are coincidentally together, maybe it's not coincidence.
Right, and that's the argument that in terms of like this episode, the theme of the Great Pyramid, I think that all of that is suggestive of something else, another time, a time beyond the explanations, the conventional and current explanations, that it's more suggestive of something else. Again, what that else is, I again couldn't say with any degree of certainty. You can only go that here based on the fact that there's all this information encoded into these structures. These structures are laid out in such a way on the ground that they mimic constellations in the sky and that they face constellations. All of that information together says something else, says that there's no at the very least it says no coincidence here. All of this was done with intention. And then the question is, well, what's to what end, right? So whoever did actually build it, there was purpose and meaning to them doing it, and we still haven't teased that out of it because we follow the hyper specialists, the authorities, because they know better, right? Without ever making a complete explanation as to the how. They never explain how. Other than in a passing way, and it's dismissive. It's actually fucking insulting because they think that they're so brilliant, we're so stupid that all they have to do is open their mouths and offer up some kind of explanation. It's good enough. Well, I don't know, just based on what little we've already talked about, I don't think so.
It would be very ironic if back then it was a tyrannical government or whatever form it would be government technically, but whatever form of governance they had was this tyrannical being, and they're like, oh, we want to make this pyramid to show when the world's going to end. And the funny thing is, we're now 60,000 years past that, and the pyramid model still goes around.
But the assumption is that somehow that it was telling a story contextually relevant to those who created it, and you offered the end of the world. To them, it might not have been that. What if?
Oh, it could have been a positive thing too. I'm just saying.
What if they treated it as an open air time capsule, because they were very regularly aware of the planet goes under through different types of catastrophes, and they're cyclical. They're not random. Again, the way that it's explained to us, that what if between every 10 and 15,000 years you have something to a scale that has an enormous effect on the planet, and the only place where you would be relatively safe is along the equatorial regions, because it might have the least effect there, but the devastating effects would exist in the upper ends of either hemisphere, the northern or southern hemisphere of the planet, and it would basically scour the surface of the planet clean. I'm not suggesting absolutely that that's what happened, but it is unreasonable then to imagine that now you have a sophisticated culture that's technically advanced, but not in the way that we are technically advanced, and they decide that to make sure that in the event that they're wiped out, their story somehow, they're able to preserve their story so that for future humans they might be able to learn from them.
Right, like the equivalent of an ark, or the ark. If you're
I would say more of a time capsule, not an ark. It's not like they're preserving themselves. They're preserving their culture, their identity, their mathematics.
Yeah, like Ark of the Covenant.
The Ark of the Covenant was not, at least biblically, not an information machine. It was God's laws passed on to man, and then it was the vessel in which they carried the.
Yeah, it's a religious face on top of the idea of passing.
Well, it's interesting you brought up the Ark of the Covenant. So inside the pyramid, there's these boxes. They're perfectly cut stone boxes. And when I say perfect, the angles are spot on. And Egyptology and archaeologists say that was where they interred the tomb, except there was no lid for the box. But the dimensions of that box match the dimensions that were given like in the Christian Bible for the dimensions of the Ark of the Covenant, and that the Ark would actually sit in there. And again, depending on whom you listen to, because it really gets crazy and far afield, there wasn't a single Ark, that there was maybe multiple Arks. And so then, I don't want to go any more into it until after I finish some of the information that I have, and then we'll come back to the Ark and energy and all this stuff, and then to make it all the more mysterious and add another layer of intrigue to the pyramid. Fair?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, cool. So there's a brilliant researcher, and again, to say he's controversial is fair, right? And his name is Brian Forster. I actually enjoy his work. He's comes across as a very grounded individual. And he's one of a number of growing researchers who speculate the pyramid was a found construction that was adopted and renamed by the dynastic Egyptians, right? That idea is gaining momentum and has some traction, and again, it's probably outside the circles of the Egyptologists and the archaeologists of the day, right? Because they're preserving the ideas of archaeology and Egyptology that have been around for like 100 years, right? And good science is replacing ideas with better ideas. You make discoveries that inform now your insights, and then it overturns what you used to think, and now what you do is now you integrate the new insight into your thinking, right? We're kind of at that stage. We have the new insights, and they're slowly being integrated. And there's some who would argue that you have to wait for the old guard, the current experts, to die off, and then the new experts would, the ones who would come up to replace them in their specific fields, Egyptology and archaeology, that they would be perhaps more open to this. And then by the time that they assume those positions, that more information might come to light to support this position, right? Now, what Brian Forster offers is that there's up as a suggestion is this: there's significant weather erosion patterning on the exterior of the pyramid. The casing stones are largely gone, and exposed interior stones to weathering. And for the weathering patterns to occur naturally would have taken a considerable amount of time for the exposure to create those effects on the stone that you go, those are, those are examples of those weathering effects on the stone, right? That's how they know that, because it'll have a certain uniformity to it, it'll look a certain specific way, and then they can tell you specifically what weathering effect produced that, right? The conventional explanations allow for the effects of erosion of just wind and sand. So the Egyptologists and the archaeologists explain away as much of the erosion as a byproduct of wind and sand blowing against the structures, right? But there's a mystery that there are signs of intense heat applied on the surface of the stone, and again, without any explanation. You have the effect where it's the effects of heat on the stone, but no known source of what would produce enough heat to be able to leave those characteristic features in the stone, right? So again, something that contributes to the idea that, like, there's something else going on here. We don't have a complete story. We only have a partial story. And the effects are so profound, like from this heat, they know that it's heat, is that once the stone has been superheated like that, and when enough time passes, the stone, like the surface layers of the stone, start to flake. So the surface layers that were exposed to the most intense heat, they over time like flake off and chip and fall away from the stone structure itself, right? Caused by the baking of the surface of the stone. So
yeah, like rapid baking.
Yeah. So again, it's just another layer of mystery to what's going on here, right? Any thoughts you'd like to share?
I'm curious. I would have to be there and like look at the stone itself, but I'm curious if like it's a very uniform dispersion of heat on the stones. Is it over a large area, over one side of the pyramid, or?
Well, again, all fair questions, and I think that you would think that would give them cause to pause and think and go, here, how can this be explained? Like, beyond the fact that an intense heat was applied here, what could produce that? Like, how would you answer those questions? And you'd think that would be worthy of investing time and research by like experts in the field, but they just ignore it outright, right?
I mean, even if you try to take like a very conservative approach of it, it's still pretty weird. It's like, what, you have friction so hot that it burns, not burns, but it reorganizes the structure of the granite. That's weird. What about microwaves? That's still weird. If you could use some sort of
I think what you're going to discover as we progress further, it does just get stranger and stranger. And it really does speak to the idea that maybe not just the Great Pyramid, but the other two pyramids and the Sphinx, they come from out of the deep past. They're not ours.
The erosion on the Sphinx would suggest that, because it doesn't look like, I've seen models, it doesn't look like sun and water.
Right, it's interesting that you bring that up. So there are geologists who argue against what the Egyptologists say, because the Egyptologists say that the erosion features on the base stone of the Sphinx, because the Sphinx has gone through a number of restorations, right? But of the original stone, it showed the stone has clear erosion features of like intense water, and we know that 10,000 years ago, the Sahara Desert today was a vast jungle, right? So it was covered in vegetation. It wasn't this dry, arid place that we know it to be now, right? And there would have been sufficient rainfall in excess of 10,000 years that could produce that effect. So if you just follow that reasoning, then at the very least, then the erosion features demonstrate that the Sphinx is very possibly much old, at the very least 10,000 years old, if not older. And because those water erosion requires significant amount of time. So that means it goes back even way past that conservative estimate of time,
Yeah.
right? So to me, it doesn't seem unreasonable to assume that it comes out of the deep, deep, dark past, right? And a past that we know virtually nothing about, right? So.
Sorry, I was just thinking.
It's okay. It's all right. It's all good. So, so outside of the actual pyramid, because we're talking about the complex, the whole Giza complex, there's a number of features there. And outside the pyramid, there are these enormous shafts that are dug into the surroundings all over the Giza plateau. And most of them, they're descending to about 40 feet, about 12 meters, to as deep as 80 feet and 24 meters. These shafts now are filled with sand from wind blowing sand all over the plain. But the depths are estimated to be even greater, hundreds of feet deep. So and these shafts, to give you an idea of the scale of them, they're 14 feet by 14 feet. So it's 4 meters, I think. Is that 4 meters square? So it's an enormous shaft and wide, and is carved into bedrock. And what's interesting is when you look at the cut features, there's signs of machining marks. Right? So the machine marks on the granite surface, which is basalt stone, which is a 7 on the Mohs scale, right? Which demonstrate obvious saw marks, and not recent, ancient saw marks, right? So then you're going what Bronze Age culture had sophisticated saws, diamond tip saws that you could cut through one of the strongest stones on the planet. So the Mohs scale was developed the Mohs scale as a mineral hardness scale from 1 to 10. Human skin would be 1 on the Mohs scale, and 10 would be diamond. And so these cut marks, these saw marks into these shafts, they clearly demonstrate the use of diamond tip saws. And diamond tip saws, for context, didn't come into widespread use until the 19th century, right? So it's relatively recent for us to be using it, right? So again, these features kind of bring into question the age, because it challenges the idea that a Bronze Age culture could be able to cut that kind of stone, and then the cut marks themselves indicate that it was a saw.
Yeah, the very strange part is just trying to conceptualize it, because at first you might think, oh, ancient Egyptians lived in a jungle. It was maybe a large tribe, whatever culture they had back then, or not culture, whatever technology they had back then. It seems like, how would you do anything amazing with it?
Well,
or if you had that technology, what kind of resources would you have to have?
To be able to for the development of that technology, it requires a significant kind of sophisticated society, and very likely far more sophisticated than the Bronze Age cultures. That's why in ancient Egypt and dynastic Egypt, they worked a lot with sandstone, because Bronze Age tools could manipulate sandstone. So it's not that they weren't great. Please don't misunderstand. The Egyptians were an astounding culture, right? But guess what? They gave up the ghost too, right? They eventually faded from history, right? So, and again, I would see it as human heritage, But when you listen to the experts, especially the Egyptian experts, to them it's more about Egyptian heritage. And I'm like, that's fair, but it's not exclusively theirs. It belongs to all of us. Again, another very, that's the objective truth, and yet what they value more than the objective truth is their subjective view of whatever, in this case, the works of ancient Egypt.
There's a few things to consider there. Like, from what I've heard, it seems like Sumerians came from the west, from the east went west. I hear some people say, "Oh, it came from South Africa," and then they went up and became.
Well, they're from Sumeria is like ancient Iran, right?
Okay,
right.
So they did go west.
Maybe. I don't. Most archaeology presumes the first formalized civilizations appeared in Sumeria, and were the Sumerians.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm led to believe that.
Well, that because that's a conventional held view.
Yeah.
Right. That, but say everything that you said is accurate, and what happened is they moved west, and then they come across these stone structures that are made of some of the hardest stone on the planet, and then it doesn't matter. So it's found, and then they adopt it, and they bring that culture their original culture that they came from, and now they kind of integrate it with all these stone structures they find that now they're living among.
Yeah, that would be obvious. It's like cultural appropriation, which is stupid.
Well, I don't know that they're necessarily appropriating it. They're just adapting it to their new surroundings, and part of the new surroundings are these fantastic stone structures.
Yeah, but if they're taking that in as part of their culture, saying like, "Oh, this is part of who we are," it's like you could consider it that. But
it is. Here's the thing: you can argue that it's cultural appropriation, but I'm just saying that it could be argued that, but it ultimately doesn't even matter. They adopted it as their own. They integrated it into their worldview and the way they're socially organized. So it became theirs. So, to be fair, there's no original idea. Everything is borrowed from somewhere else. So the fact that somebody would sit there and point fingers and go, you're appropriating someone else's culture. No, they're integrating it into theirs. So if they adopt it, integrate it into theirs, and it becomes part of theirs, guess what? It's part of their culture now too.
Yeah, that wasn't like the main point of this. What I was saying is like, possibly they came from the east, went west, or they came from south, went north. Who knows? But I forget where I was going with that, but essentially what I was going to go with, like, this whole idea of like, they found this culture, they started running with the idea that it's theirs historically, so they started going, we have the right to be dogmatic about it. Personally, I believe if you really do have the view that it's all human history, that means, like, even current events going on now is part of human history. We shouldn't have to remove ourselves from this whole idea, like, they're Egyptian, or they're this, or they're that.
I'm in complete agreement with you. To me, it's all just human history. It's the telling of all of our story.
Yeah, and if it's like 60,000 years, 12,000 years, whatever, it's like, that's so far back. We're probably descendants of someone, or we know someone who's a descendant of.
Okay, and to be fair, that all of this is outside of the conventional model and view of the way that our ancient past, right? And it's challenged, very often challenged by academics. They don't like it, and they don't like the researchers who are not experts in the field, but that doesn't mean that the work they're doing is any less diligent and thoughtful, and they're not. What makes them better at researching the subject is they come at it with an open mind. Whereas the conventional academics, they're protecting their interests. They're the experts, and they're beyond being questioned,
Right. Like if you go to the Pyramid of Giza, the first thing you're gonna ask is like, are these measurements accurate? Let me ask a mathematician, not an Egyptologist. Is the erosion accurate to like 12,000 years ago? Like
Then
this
you
guy
need a
says.
geologist to
Exactly.
weigh in on that, right? Like, you would think you would. To me, I always, because and it shows how naive I was. I always thought that all these different areas of science would act in support of one another, and then when you had one who had a very specific view, and that view became challenged by not just one other area of expertise, but maybe a couple of them, that they would then think that, oh, maybe we need to look at this again and reconsider our position, that perhaps we may be wrong.
No, there's like dogmatism built in. I felt the same way you did, and that's the really unsettling part.
Well, I again, it just speaks to, because we just assume that they all work in mutual support of one another, and they don't. Remember, all the best science today is bought and paid for. So you should be suspicious of what any expert's saying, right? Because they're accountable to someone else. They're not accountable to you. They're just conveying a very specific narrative to you.
It's always nice to see professionals that are in the field actually stand up and go, "Hey, I'm dedicated to my field, not to my position of authority," and they'll go through the reasons.
Well, there's I'm aware that there's been a number of experts in fields who did that very thing. They stood up and went, like, that's wrong, and then as a result of it, basically they were ostracized by their peers, and their careers were basically ruined.
That's painful on an individual level, but also at like.
Oh, it's shameful behavior. So for the academics and experts who fucking employed those tactics, fuck you, man.
Yeah, from all of humanity.
From all of humanity. Let me be the voice.
I mean, I'm gonna try to. I mean, fuck you guys.
Fuck you, man.
We can all say it eventually.
So the dynastic people of Egypt were they were a Bronze Age culture. So it occurred to me that maybe we should kind of like define what's characteristic of Bronze Age cultures. And they're known primarily for 5 inventions or achievements. 1, the use of the wheel, irrigation, and dedicated fields for planting. The bronze plow, which allowed for them to work the fields so they could plant edibles, and not the pot kind, but sustainable food stuffs. The bronze axe and sword, and a writing system. So the Bronze Age, by the very definition of the experts, are the first stages of technical and sophisticated society, right? But so in them just discovering the wheel, just having adopted, agrarian approach to culture, to mass producing food and stuff like that. Do you think that somehow these people were now suddenly capable of creating something like the Great Pyramid? To me, again, just seems like these two things do not align.
I don't think one necessarily means the other. Like, you think Bronze Age, that is sophisticated. Like, that is tough to do.
And I acknowledge the fact that, like, they probably were fantastic at working softer stone. That's why they used sandstone.
Right, but like the whole language system thing, that takes a long time to develop. Now you're telling me they did that plus math plus like
they figured out the dimensions of the planet. How would you do that?
They had 5 geniuses in 1 year.
Well,
like,
again, here's a fair question. How would you know the shape and the diameter of that shape, like in specific length?
Really good math.
As a Bronze Age culture, how would you know? All right, and again, a question that's never adequately addressed by either Egyptology or archaeology.
I feel like that's something that's like mathematics dependent. I don't think you would actually need like huge amount of resources to figure it out. You just need you need people really good.
Well, you need to know that you fucking live on a fucking sphere.
Yeah,
So
that
what?
might not be a hard thing to discover though.
Uh,
To us, it might be.
well, no. Well, we. It's funny because it's just thinking, oh, you said for us it might be. I'm going, all the flat earthers. Fuck you, buddy. Um, but that for them to understand, where did that understanding come from?
If
They,
they were
they
able to make not magnifying glasses, but the lenses, and then make a telescope, they could then find the curvature of the Earth using fairly basic means. But the math is the hard part.
Okay, so I now would you say that's characteristic, especially when one of the primary achievements is just a writing system, that somehow they went from a writing system to the level of sophisticated math and being able to create. Now, mind you, in their time, they stared up at the nighttime sky. They could cultivate like an understanding of the precession, like that we move through cycles because constellations would reappear and they would be in different positions of the sky as you move through the year. So you could more or less come to those conclusions, but I'm going, you would need exceptionally brilliant people to be able to say that, yeah, we're on a rock that's in the shape of a ball.
Yeah, I was gonna say not too much about like this Egyptian pyramids and all this stuff really amazes me. The part that really amazes me is like to be able to do the mathematics they did with like even rudimentary like things like sticks and like using the sun.
Yeah, right. It's just observation.
Right. But you don't get that with the writing system. You need the writing system first. You need the aggregate, the what was it, aggregation, like the waterways,
Irrigation.
irrigation. You need like the farm, like all these
Agrarian
things.
society,
Yeah.
so farming.
All of this has to be put in place like 100 years before you're at the level to even do these maths. So in my head, this is where I'm a conspiracy theorist. They were functioning at like maybe 1600s, 1700s level, like after
Yeah, but 1700s they were working iron.
Yep.
Right. So they again did demonstrate a greater degree of sophistication, and in the 1700s, really advanced thinking was coming about. But again, it was the Renaissance, and so it was a rebirth of the classical periods. And the classical periods they considered like ancient Greece and Rome, and I suppose you could put ancient Egypt in there too. That because those held a significant fascination, particularly for Western Europe. They were fascinated by ancient Greeks and Romans and Egyptians, and that fascination still lives on until today. But in the 1800s, it was extremely popular, right? Because again, largely because how much of a mystery it was, that it's what drove the imagination of people who were exposed to it. And it's still to this day that's true. Like the fact that these things exist and we don't have like an absolute definitive explanation as to why they exist and what they are makes for fertile ground for your imagination to start going to work, right?
Oh, you're looking for an answer? Yeah, no, 100%.
No, just it was rhetorical, right? So okay, it's all good.
Like we're problem-solving creatures. Of course, we're gonna see that, and like we're just dialed in. We're so excited.
Yeah, I think about like how much pyramids and even ancient Egypt, how much it's affected the creativity of humans, like for the last 2,000 years, right? From like sci-fi shows like Stargate, where the aliens had like used pyramid-shaped ships. They weren't exclusively a pyramid; they were a pyramid with all these other structures. But it's infused itself into our culture. So we didn't appropriate it. We're so fascinated by it that we integrated it into who we are, and the idea of it, again, drives our imagination and allows for us to make interesting content that's loosely based on all that stuff.
If they made a great castle, not nearly as interesting. Part of the interesting part is like the function of this thing is unknown. Saying it's a tomb, it seems completely unreasonable to me. So it's like, why would you put so many years, so many lives just into building this thing?
I wish we had a definitive answer, because it's, when you think about it, it's really fascinating. Okay, I think we're going to move on to Christopher Dunn, and this will go towards explaining the function, or the potential function of the Great Pyramid, right? And so again, this is going to add another. It's certainly controversial, but it'll add another layer of mystery and intrigue to, like, what is this thing, right? Like, so Christopher Dunn, he's a mechanical engineer, very, very brilliant man. And he's written a number of books. I'll give you the names of the books, so that if anyone who's listening is interested, should check out his stuff. And remember, I was saying in the opening that, like, in the 70s, there was this fascination with pyramid power, and it was the mysticism that has surrounded Giza, and those of us from the Western world are expressing our fascination with it, right? So it was based on the shape of the pyramid, and that somehow that shape alone had energetic properties that were mystical instead of practical energy, and based on people's experiences and books making claims at that time to that end, that you could put like razor blades in a pyramid shaped structure, so people would create a framed out pyramid. And then if you put fruit in it, the fruit wouldn't decay and stuff like that. Like I said, the mysticism that grew up around it was quite fascinating, and people wrote books about it. But what it did was it just fed more into that fascination for pyramids, and particularly Giza, right? So Chris Dunn, one of his first books, is this something you want to say?
Oh no. Well, I guess it's funny to notice, like, when we have an idea we don't understand, we just play with the idea.
Right.
I think that's fun.
Yeah, and I think you should have fun with this. It's why we talk about these things on and this channel exists. It's for that end. It's to have fun with these ideas. And so what could be more fun and fascinating, right? So Christopher Dunn wrote in 1999, The Giza Power Plant. And this is the title of the book, The Giza Power Plant, Technologies of Ancient Egypt, paperback. It's August 1st, 1999. And then he wrote Lost Technologies of Ancient Egypt, Advanced Engineering in the Temples of the Pharaohs. And that came out in June 24th of 2010, right? And he essentially reverse engineered the structure of the pyramid. So he looked at it with the eye of an engineer, like, so in terms of why they used they built it in the specific way that they did, and what that would say about its function. Like, what if you built it in a particular way, it was to support it being able to do something specifically, right? So so without getting into it too deeply, like, you should read his books. They're absolutely fascinating. And apparently he's writing another one, follow-up to the Giza power plant currently, right? So in reverse engineering, you can determine the function and answer questions about how and why it was constructed. In operation effects, based on the way it was designed, so how it would work and what it would do based on those very designs, and the precision of the builds, the angles, the shapes, the very machine-like features of it. And to him, ultimately, it was reduced to that it produces energy. What struck him most was the incongruity of the small shafts considered important to the function of the machine. So I don't know if you know, but there's a king chamber and there's two shafts that lead to the outside of the pyramid, and then you can see stars through those, right? Like a certain time of year, there'll be, if you stare through it, there'll be a star in the center of it. But in the queen's chambers, there's two shafts, and the two shafts only penetrate to so far into the pyramid, and then they stop. So eventually they had put robot rovers into these shafts in the queen's chamber, and they went to the end of the shaft, and guess what they found? It was a door. That door appeared to have two metal handles.
Oh, we've seen this, yeah.
Yeah, and so then eventually what they did was they drilled a hole and set a fiber optic filament through the hole to see what was beyond the door, and what they discovered was another vast space and then another door. So they think that those metal, because some confuse them for handles because of their shape, that they're capacitors. So, and before they had done all that robot work, based on his own ideas, Christopher Dunn was stating that if you go past that door or that blockage at the end of either of the shafts in the queen's chamber, you're going to find another space and another door. This is before they sent the rovers. So, and he said because that makes sense in context of a machine that's designed to generate and transmit energy, right? So the Giza power plant is described as a coupled oscillator. Oscillators connected in such a way that energy can be transferred between them and connected to the earth, tuned vibrationally to it. So everything vibrates. So it drew from the inherent vibrational frequency of the planet, and then it built up that energy, accumulated the energy, and then was able to transmit it, right? And it reacted to the pulse frequency and vibration of the earth, and through that able to stimulate electron flow into the central granite chamber and produced microwave energy, solid state electron harvester, drawing energy directly from the earth while burning without burning fossil fuels. Excuse me. The Giza power plant technologies of ancient Egypt, and that you'll find that in the paperback. So this culture who developed it, they were so sophisticated they used natural materials, applied mechanical engineering for the construction, design, and implementation, so that it would be a functional machine, not like machines that we think, but a machine that would derive or draw energy from the inherent vibrational frequency of the planet. And it was probably stimulated by the fact that there used to be underground rivers that ran through by the Great Pyramid, just underneath it. So yeah. These aquifers might have contributed to it too, right? So when the dynastic Egyptians found it, it was a skeleton of a machine, right? So it was a machine that had a very specific function. And there's further details which I didn't include in this note package, but that would again lend more credibility to that idea. And then going back to what we're talking about, the Ark of the Covenant and the box and the king, I believe it's in the king's chamber, that granite, they call it the sarcophagus, but without a lid. And its dimensions exactly mention the dimensions of the Ark of the Covenant, and that it might have been a part of the functioning machine. You inserted it in there, and that the cherubim on the surface of the Ark. Remember, the Ark was considered to be this very powerful machine. It levitated on its own. It radiated energy that would kill people who were unprotected, and now it sits at the, and the wild speculation is now it could potentially sit at the center of this machine. So then this culture that developed it, if it was for the purposes of power, they were wirelessly transmitting power across the planet. Well, let me ask you, how many Bronze Age cultures do that? None. The answer is none. You don't even need to think about it. So then it speaks to the fact that the Great Pyramid and the entire Giza Plateau, including the Sphinx, was part of something else that we can't imagine. We don't have any reference point. We don't have a frame of reference to make sense of it all. But this gives us an insight, a window into what it may have been used for, which is fascinating. So then it brings up this question: how many advanced human cultures have there been in our ancient past that were devastated through climatic effects or catastrophic celestial events, like, outgassing from coronal mass ejections from the sun, to asteroids, to cometary impacts, and basically they were resets. They just reduced the human population to like maybe tens of thousands of people, and with not even a vague memory of what they were. And then when they would tell stories amongst themselves, they'd talk about gods, and these gods who presented like humans, looked like humans, and behaved like humans, except they were the great creators. Well, maybe they weren't great creators. Maybe they were just us, right?
Yeah. Like, how hard would it be to have a culture that assumes something that looks like it is something different because it acts differently?
Well, again, like, we know that cargo cults exist, and think about when the Americans during World War II were fighting in the South China Sea, and they were pushing back against the Japanese, and they were invading islands, and they would create land strips on islands for delivery of, much needed food and munitions and stuff to support the war effort, and the indigenous people would see them. And then after the Americans left, they, out of bamboo and plant matter, they would make mock-ups of planes, and they'd maintain the runways, keep them clear, so that one day the gods would return. They made uniforms that looked like American military uniforms, and they carried bamboo weapons that looked like rifles.
Yeah, they built a culture around their version of
Well, they just integrated all that stuff they were exposed to into their culture.
Yeah.
Their existing culture. So they just adopted all this other stuff. So, and they were people who were even less than a Bronze Age culture. They were Stone Age hunter-gatherers, now that who were exposed to 20th century technology, and then mimicked it. And then still, and I imagine still to this day, are waiting for their gods to return. So is it too far afield then to imagine that the Egyptians, whomever they were originally, the pre-dynastic Egyptians who ended up discovering the Giza Plateau, ended up integrating it into them, and they're to a lesser or greater extent were a cargo cult, right? Based on a culture that predates them, that we were only guessing how old they must have been, and in all likelihood probably a planetary level society.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, they had a solid state energy
harvester. That's what the pyramid is.
Well, yeah, no, I wasn't sure exactly if it was harvester, deplete, or whatever you call it, but like this idea of like harnessing energy that's ambient, but using it through advanced not chemical, specifically not chemical, because that's what we're doing now. Like, we
harness explosions. They were harnessing a much more
reusable energy.
Yeah, like, and it was way more subtle, right? So I go, so imagine if we discovered the secrets to Nikola Tesla, love you, that maybe that's what he had discovered. What he had discovered wasn't a discovery. It was a rediscovery, something that came out of our ancient past. He formulated the ideas on his own, but it wasn't the first time that humans had done something like that. And then, of course, what happened? We see what happened to people like him and Victor Schauberger and Wilhelm Reich talking about orgone energy, like free ambient energy. They were destroyed. And they're destroyed by very selfish, self-interested human beings.
And the concept isn't way out there either. The idea of like ionized air could be harnessed for this or that. That's something that people are doing. Solid state batteries are something that people are doing too.
Yeah, like I said, to me, it speaks more to the collective greatness of humanity, not a particular group of humans, but of humanity in itself, and that it comes to us from out of that deep dark past, and it says that, hey, we were doing this, you could do this. We don't have to be idiots and do the shit that we do. Because remember, look, just think about the energy consumption and how we produce energy in the modern way that we organize as a society. It's the most dangerous method that we sit on the precipice of devastation every day that we use it. Doubt me? Fukushima. Right? I go, come on. What was the in the 80s in Russia? Shit. They had that nuclear reactor basically explode and irradiate. I can't remember the name now, escapes me. Chernobyl, thank you very much. So we already have examples of the level of stupidity, and nobody gives it a second thought. So it's this level of idiocy that, because you have basically morons running everything. And let me be clear, I do not think highly of any authority within the institutions that exist within the way that we organize as country and nations currently on this planet. They're all selfish, greedy, fucking the worst of what humans could be. And yes, they're toted, like held up in high regard. No. Wrong thinking. They're completely servants to their subjectivity. They don't counterbalance it with any kind of objectivity to discover an objective truth that might be more profound than their selfish self-interest, their preferences, their biases and prejudices. Everything that we talk about on this channel, none of it is isolated from any of the other content. All of that stuff overlaps. And all we're doing is pointing out to you where exactly in all of that it does overlap. So everything from economics to how we power our societies, how we form the structure of the society, all that stuff, none of it's accidental. Right? Can I get a time check?
Yep. We're 1 hour, 30 minutes in.
Okay, you know what? I don't really have anything else I want to contribute. I think I said it all sufficiently. Is there anything you'd like to say?
Well, we can definitely disagree on some of the things, but at the same time, it's like to say that cut and dry what we're told is what we get. No.
Yeah, I'm in agreement. We should always be looking for better answers. We should always be questioning everything we think we know. And this is how we really rise to our full potential. It's in the asking of the questions, not in the assumption that somehow you have all the answers. It's the question that drives us. It's a question that serves us best, not the answers, and particularly not the answers by experts who are bought and paid for. Right? So that's all I think I have to say in closing. I think that was a pretty good close. Yeah. So in closing, I would like to say, question everything, including yourself. Seek balance. Seek knowledge. Seek understanding. Become a renegade, individualist, humanist, critical, objective thinker. Thank you for your time.